All right, we're recording.
I want to start off by telling a story that happened back in May. I was in Medina visiting a friend I haven't seen in a while, so we decided to spend the night going bar hopping. We eventually ended up at this Irish pub called Sully's where we had a few pints of Guinness. At the end of the night, we decided to call an Uber to head home. Now, we summoned what we would eventually come to realize was the only Uber driver in about a 20-minute radius. So, I don't know if you guys have gotten an Uber before. It's usually a pretty quiet experience. Not this time. It took about 15 minutes to get home, and unprovoked, this man decided to go on this 15-minute diatribe about his rival, the other Lyft driver in the area. He started from the very beginning. He told us about how he noticed her green SUV with a little Lyft light in the windshield. He told us about how she stole his parking spaces and his customers. And then eventually he led up to this point where they had this interaction, which he used some choice words that I'm not going to repeat here, but you can probably assume how that went. It was all very anecdotal, and it got me thinking about two things. First, it showed me about a little bit of a better idea of who this person was. I'm not an Uber driver, I can barely drive my own car, but it showed me what it was like to be him. I know what it's like to compete for work, just like he had with the Lyft driver. The second thing it made me think about was about the stories that we decide to tell each other and what they say about us. Stories are a big part of my life. I'm a writing major here with a minor in English, and I used to joke that I'm actually a story major just because of how much my life here at Mount Union has revolved around stories. But it's not just listening and interpreting stories. I like to find new ways of telling stories as well. My freshman year here, I wrote a story, but an unreliable narrator who's actually a dog. My last year, I wrote a story in the second person point of view where the narrator dies in the beginning and we find out what happens after his passing. So all of this led up to me thinking of what I was going to do for my senior writing project. I wanted to do something that was within my scope of experience, but was also going to feel fresh. And all this led up to me thinking about a story about stories where the act of storytelling takes precedence over the content of the narrative. Thinking back to my experience in the Uber, I wanted to create something that shows the power that storytelling has on the unsuspecting everyday person. What this would do is explore the relationship that we have with storytelling, not just as a form of entertainment, but as a form of communication. Since the days of oral tradition with Homer and the Odyssey, we've used stories as a way of influencing those around us because they provide a medium for us to share our experiences. Jonathan Gottschall is one of the many literary scholars who has studied our relationship with stories and the effect that they have on us. In his book, The Storytelling Animal, he discusses our fascination with stories because they allow us to feel and experience things like loss, anger, danger, and situations that we don't normally want to put ourselves in. It's a way for us to learn and grow as a people in a passive sense, in the way that we can live vicariously through the experience of others, even if the story itself is completely fictitious. A great example of oral tradition is the Anglo-Saxon story of Beowulf. The storytellers of their time, also known as shopes, were tasked with carrying the cultures and traditions of their people through their use of epic poetry. On the surface level, Beowulf is about a man who overcomes insurmountable odds to defeat monsters in order to save his people. But if you dig into it, it's actually very rich in tradition as well, carrying themes of bravery and heroism that would go on to inspire the people listening to it. And if you think about today, nothing has really changed. We love stories like the Avengers and Star Wars because we love seeing our favorite heroes battle out on the big screen in situations that we can't necessarily put ourselves into, but there's also a lot that we can identify with them. Take someone like Luke Skywalker, for example. He lives in a galaxy far away. He battles the forces of evil with a laser sword, but there's still a lot to his story that we can look at and identify with and take away. He's brave, he's heroic, he experiences loss and danger and pain, and he can act as a role model for who we can model ourselves after in our society. Now, There is a reason why we are able to pull these lessons and experiences from stories, and it's very easily explained in Free Text Pyramid. It's because of how they are fundamentally built. For those who don't know what Free Text Pyramid is, it's essentially a way of breaking down a narrative in its most basic form. It's created by Gustav Freitag, who's a German playwright, and he borrowed ideas of plot from Aristotle. The vast majority of narratives use this model, and I'm sure it sounds very familiar. The basic rundown of the arc is that it starts with the exposition. This is where we learn about the characters, the setting, and it sets up what's going to happen in the rest of the narrative. The rising action then takes the protagonist and forces a problem on him. This is where we meet the antagonist. The climax is the turning point of the story where the protagonist is forced to overcome the obstacles that have been building up. From there we have the falling action, then after that, the denouement, which is the French word for a knot. This is where everything comes together, the lessons are learned, and we're finally able to see the character change that is developed throughout the story. Now, according to Lisa Roney at the University of Central Florida, there's a reason why this arc works. She says that the arc provides emotional satisfaction because oftentimes real life doesn't have real resolutions or resolutions that work in a way that we can pull experiences from. The denouement is the answer to this problem. It's our way of capping off the story in a way that somehow is satisfying to us because it's not something that's afforded to us in real life. What I'm trying to get at is that stories can leave us more with just so much more than just a simple narrative. When we reach the denouement of a story, we are left with a certain feeling because of how we interpret the story and its meanings and messages. Maybe we feel some sort of sense of heroism or we learn a valuable life lesson. This is what I wanted to focus on when I was writing my SCE. I wanted to know, I asked myself, what happens or what could happen after the end? I started with a simple frame narrative which details the story of a cab driver named Harvey who transports his passengers in exchange for stories. Harvey is an everyday person. He brings with him his own perspectives and values on life, and his main struggle in this story is his troubled relationship with his son Charlie, who he hasn't seen or talked to in many years. We also have three storytellers who are much like him. They're all independent from each other, they bring their own experiences, and the only interaction they will ever have with Harvey is in their commutes in his cab when they tell him the stories. Now, I'm sure a story about strangers traveling and telling stories might sound a little bit familiar to some of you, especially to those who are fans of early British literature. I pulled a lot of inspiration from the story through Geoffrey Chaucer's The Canterbury Tales. And in a way, this was kind of my homage to what Chaucer did. When I read the tales in high school, it was the first time I really noticed what can be done with a frame narrative. I really liked the way that the characters interacted, and it wasn't just the tales themselves that I was interested in, but how the tales played into the bigger part of the story. For example, in the beginning, the knight finishes his tale about chivalrous love. From there, before the monk can tell his piece, a very drunken miller tells his very raunchy take on what love can be. From there, the reeve becomes very offended at this, so then he launches into his own story that's aimed to fire back at the miller. Without the knight's tale, we wouldn't get the miller's tale. Without the miller's tale, we wouldn't get the reeve's. Without the frame tale itself, it's just a collection of stories without any sort of context or direction. But with the frame, the stories each have their own specific purpose. But for the folks here who have never bothered to learn Middle English, there are a lot of other good examples of frame narratives in action in the modern day. Think about James Cameron's Titanic. Think about James Cameron's Titanic. It's a frame narrative about Rose on her expedition to find the heart of the sea. During the expedition, she tells her story about her time on the Titanic with Jack and her love affair with him. Flash forward, her story is so powerful that Lovett, the person who's heading the expedition, decides to call it off altogether. Again, without the frame, the story of Rose still works, but with it, we can see how far she's come as a character and how her story can go on to inspire those around her. In my story, In Transit, Harvey tells his story. Harvey's story arc is only progressed as the three storytellers tell their stories to him. The first one comes from a guy named Don Mann. Don Man is a businessman who tells his story about one of his coworkers. This initially reminds Harvey of his son, and it's my way of easing the reader into this progressive change that happens throughout the rest of the story. The next one is a storyteller named Marley, who tells her tale of a friend that she was forced to abandon many years ago. This one is a little bit more specific to Harvey's situation, and at the end of her story, he actually goes out of his way to give her the advice that he himself needs to hear. The third and final story is a manuscript written by a college writing student, and it details the relationship between a father and his son who own a restaurant together. Whereas the first two stories act as sort of a primer for Harvey to get him thinking about his son, this one is really his call to action. Spoiler alert, at the end of the story, Harvey ends up contacting his son based on what he's heard throughout the night. The stories he's heard throughout the night give him a retroactive perspective into his life and about the choices that he's made with his son. It didn't matter that none of the stories were explicitly about him, because he was able to draw his own meanings and interpretations from what he's heard. Kind of like I did when I based my SCE and presentation off of what I heard in an Uber late at night, drunk. And that's where I'm going to leave you at. Storytelling has this intrinsic power that lets us inspire, to teach, and to share experiences. I'm not saying that every story needs to end with a call to action, but we should be aware of this power that each and every one of us has. To not just tell a story, but your story. To share experiences with others that will let them grow, to pass on the weight of something that has truly affected you. We all have our stories to tell, and we should, because there's a lot that happens after the end. Thank you. Any questions? It's been a long time. Head out.
So what about stories that don't provide you with a denouement? They just stop, and you're left to wonder. Which are, I would say personally, my favorite kinds of stories. But how does that fit into the frame where you're thinking about your work?
Well, I think that you said that they still make us wonder. And that's kind of what Harvey does in this story. It's more about him listening to these stories than the stories themselves. So it doesn't necessarily matter how they end, it's the thought process that he goes through throughout the narrative. So even if it leaves us with some sort of thought process, if it changes us, then I think that in a way it's still the same. It's in the same vein.
And not to steal the thunder from your public reading, but the third story doesn't even get finished. Right, so there's this way in which the denouement of the third story doesn't even happen, and yet there's this call to action. So that's a really interesting way to do it. He had enough of the story. He didn't need closure on the story.
Yeah.
He got the message and he acts. Yeah.
This really makes me think of Dubliners. Actually, it makes me think of Irish literature in general.
Really? Thank you,
Yeah,
Dr.
a lot of
Fights
Irish
again.
literature. How do you? So what do you do with collection of like stories that aren't connected with a frame tale? Like how do you kind of tie that into what you're doing, or did you think about it at all?
Well, originally, I mean, this my whole project was kind of going in that direction, where I didn't always have the Harvey's story arc wasn't as in depth, and it was going to be more like a collection of stories. So, well, you're asking specifically a story without a frame, kind of like what you did, right?
Sure. Yeah.
So you're
yeah. Thanks, Ryan.
Well, something like Dubliners still has this overall message. It's about life in Dublin, or around Dublin. It's about the experiences and kind of what it's like to live in that time and that kind of culture. So there is still a lot that can be taken away from those collections, because they usually do come with some sort of greater message that we can still think about.
Well, I know you settled, so it's settled. I helped you settle on 3 stories just for the sake of scope of finishing the project. You know, what would the scope have been? of your writing project, let's say, if you felt it was finished and weren't limited by the frame of time?
Originally, in the early stages of me drafting this out, it was going to be much longer. It still might be. I do want to focus more on Harvey, and then potentially he could go on to talk about the experiences he had that night listening to these stories. He could go on to tell his own take on what those stories could be. It's an ongoing process, which fits into the theme of there's so much more that happens after the end. It's where do we leave off when we finish the story, when we take away something from what we just heard. So Harvey changes. Maybe it could have explored his relationship with his son after he's reached out and made that contact after so many years. If that answers your question.
Margaret Atwood actually does an interesting job of doing what you're suggesting in Stone Mattress.
Okay.
If you've not read that, you might want to read that.
Sure.
It's loosely connected individual stories that are all connected in some way. And it's incredibly fascinating how they all connect, but they also don't have to.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a really good example of what you're trying to do.
And they also connect to characters she created earlier.
Right.
And so they're now much older than they were in her special. But it works even if you haven't read the earlier.
You said that's Stone Mattress?
Stone Mattress.
Stone Mattress. Thank you, Ryan. I imagine that you all may wish to race home so that you can watch the debates.